Hello, my name is Emily Rokosh, and I'm with Jasmine, the Jacksonville Area Sexual Minority Youth Network, and I'm here today to talk to Volusia County about LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender student sensitivity training. I've been with Jasmine for over 5 years. A lot of my background comes from supporting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students in a higher education center. I previously was at the University of California, Los Angeles as the director of their LGBT Resource Center, and now I'm back at Jasmine as the director of operations. Jasmine, we're about an hour and a half north of Volusia County. We've been in Jacksonville, Florida for about 20 years, providing a safe space, advocating, and supporting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender young people. Most of the youth that we serve are between the ages of 13 and 23, and we do a lot of different services for them beyond a safe space. We have a free STI and HIV health clinic. We do a lot of case management services. We do a lot of HIV testing and education. And then of course we do a lot of advocacy, whether that's through LGBT diversity trainings, consultations, trainings like this where we talk about how other agencies and schools can provide a safe space for LGBT students. What I'm here to do today is to talk to you a little bit about unfamiliar concepts and define terminology as it relates to sexual orientation and gender identity, present a broad overview of barriers that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students face, as well as how to be an effective advocate in your classroom or in your school. I'm also here to share some resources because there's a lot more to supporting LGBT students than what I'm going to be able to get through today. You're also going to note that when I say LGBT, you're also going to see the Q in this presentation. And when I say LGBTQ, I'm talking about questioning students. So a couple notes on terminology. When we're talking about language and supporting LGBT students, the words that we use and how we use them are the most important way that you can be an advocate. I'm going to go over some basic terminology, but you need to remember that it's constantly in flux. So what I might be saying today, it could change in a year. And if you're uncertain when supporting a student, just ask the student what those terms mean to them and how they identify. The other thing to note when talking about terms and defining people and putting labels on them is often they lack a cross-cultural continuity. So what you're saying to one student might not ring true to another student, so always be aware of that. And also when you're looking at the PowerPoint today, some of the terms in red are terms that you might still use or you might hear. They could be outdated or offensive, and so that's going to make it really clear on some of the terms that are okay to use or that you might want to use caution. All right, like I said a little bit before, I'm going to talk about gender and sexuality in a continuum, because what we know, especially for students coming into their own and really learning who they are, it's always a spectrum. And so I'm going to define sexual orientation in a spectrum, gender identity, gender expression, and of course gender assignment, all which does fall into that spectrum, and hopefully by the end of this you're going to realize how fluid all of these things really are. All right, so sexual orientation. Everybody has a sexual orientation, and that's really our physical and emotional attractions. The spectrum that I'm pulling up here, you've got attracted to women on one end, attracted to men on the other end, and of course in between, attracted to both or multiple genders. Some of the examples that are pretty familiar to you on this slide are probably heterosexual, straight, gay, bisexual, lesbian. I'm sure many of you have met students who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual. Some of the other identities that our students are identifying as is queer, pansexual, and asexual. And I'm going to define those a little bit later on. The outdated terms that you're going to see on this slide, you've probably heard them in the halls: dyke, fag, even that's so gay. Those aren't outdated, those are offensive terms that I always challenge you when you hear those to immediately correct them and move on from there. The outdated terms that you see here in red are more identity, more lifestyle or preference. And so we're not going to get into a debate about lifestyle or preference, but when supporting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students, if you use the word preference or lifestyle, you're going to lose them. They're going to make an assumption that you are not an ally or you're not going to be able to advocate for them. So I always say use caution when using those words. Now, I did mention asexuality. We're talking about that more and more. Like I said, everybody has a sexual orientation, and asexuality is one of those. And that's really that lack of sexual attraction to anyone or an absent or low interest in sexual activity. Every asexual person experiences life different. They experience relationships different and attraction different. But more and more students are naming this, as a sexual orientation, and you're going to have to be able to support everybody where they're at. Another orientation and identity that more young people are identifying as is pansexual. And I'm going to explain this a little bit further on when we're talking about gender identity. But pansexual is even more fluid than queer or bisexuality. This sexual orientation encompasses all genders. It's really not limiting your sexual or emotional attraction with regard to that biological gender, that gender identity. So it's very inclusive of male, female, transgender, genderqueer individuals. And I'm going to define those as we go on. All right, these next set of terms and terminology are more around gender and gender identity, and they're really going to give you a good idea and concept on how to support our transgender students. The terms that I previously talked about were about sexual orientation, and so now we're moving on to gender identity. And I think the most important thing to remember to think about is that they're very different. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not the same thing. Our transgender identified students, they can be straight, they can be gay, they can be bisexual, they can be pansexual, and people confuse those a lot, probably because that we lump the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender all together, but note it's not the same thing. So when supporting transgender students, we really have to look at gender, outside of the traditional sex assigned at birth. It's a little bit broader than that, and I'm going to go over 3 components of gender that's going to help you understand. All right, so our sex assigned at birth. That is how we all grew up learning about gender. It really is a way to categorize humans based on physical characteristics, hormones, chromosomes, secondary sex characteristics. And really when we're talking about a sex assigned at birth, most people are focused and concerned around genitals. You've got the male on one side, you've got female on the other side of the spectrum, and then in between, we don't talk about intersex individuals a lot, but there are individuals that are born with mixed anatomical characteristics, higher levels of female hormones, different levels of male hormones, and that outdated term, which many people are familiar with, is hermaphrodite. So that is outdated, and we do not use that anymore. We use the term intersex. And for most people, their sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity, and that is called cisgender. When we're supporting transgender students, we really have to focus on what's between the ears, how somebody chooses to identify. And for our transgender individuals, what's between the ears, how they identify, is not the same, and it doesn't quite match up with the sex assigned at birth. So you're going to see on this continuum that there's a lot of identities beyond the male and the female. You're going to see genderqueer, bigender, third gender, transgender. All of these identities do not really fit into that binary of male and female. So what does it mean to be transgender? Transgender is when a person's gender identity or expression doesn't line up with that societal expectation. Kind of like I said before, that sex assigned at birth, based on genitals, does not match with what's between the ears. So what isn't transgender? And this is really important. Transgender isn't a drag performance, although individuals who are transgender may participate in drag. It isn't just plain dress up, and it isn't cross-dressing. And I used the term cisgender before, but I'm going to define it one more time because it's a term that's been around forever, but we have just started using it when talking about supporting transgender and cisgender students. So cisgender is people whose assigned gender and gender identity align with those conventional norms. That means that individual's sex assigned at birth matches up with their gender expression and matches up with their gender identity. And so that's cisgender. You're going to see an offensive term down at the bottom of the screen, tranny. Now, I know some of you may think, who would use that word tranny? But that's one of the words that we hear in the halls at schools or that we hear to use to put down transgender students. That is an offensive term. All right, gender expression. So I've talked about sex assigned at birth, gender assignment, gender identity, and finally gender expression, which is probably the most broad of all these terms. And that's really how we dress, what our mannerisms are, what roles do we take, how do we groom, how do we talk. It varies across culture. And the masculine and feminine expressions, society gives us a little bit more leeway. You're going to see that not everybody falls into the straight masculine category expressing their gender or the straight feminine category. I always like to joke around that even the most feminine cisgender woman out there who loves to put on high heels and pearls and goes out to dinner, they do not dress that way when they're gardening. So their gender expression when they're gardening in pants and a hat and gloves is very different from their expression when they're out. So everybody's gender expression varies from day to day, from time to time, from what you're doing. And students in school, especially high school and middle school, gender expression is where students have more liberty to just be who they are and express themselves differently. And the majority of the bullying that happens in the schools, in the hallways, really out in the world is based on gender expression and the assumptions that people make on individuals' gender expression. All right, so before I define a few more terms and then move on to how to support LGBT students, I just want to point out that identity and attraction and behavior. I've used these terms, and they're connected, but they're not the same. And so it's really important when a student is coming out to you, when you're supporting a transgender student or you're supporting a gay student who's just coming into their identity, that attraction doesn't necessarily indicate behavior. So a student does not have to have same-sex behavior with another person to know they're gay or lesbian, and behavior doesn't necessarily indicate identity. And so that's, these are really important to understand, because when you're asked how many LGBT students do you have in your school, it's going to be really hard to define. Some individuals might have a boyfriend or girlfriend that could be considered LGBT, but they don't identify as lesbian or gay. So you're never going to know. So I know it's hard to understand and put together, but attraction doesn't indicate behavior, and behavior doesn't indicate identity. I always like to say, just support the student where they're at with what they're going through, and you can't go wrong. So I've got a couple more terms. I'm sure everybody has heard the two words coming out. You're going to see some images on the screen as well. More and more actresses, news anchors, people in the spotlight are coming out, and that really means acknowledging your sexual orientation, who you are, your gender identity, and then sharing that with yourself and others. I think the big misconception today is because there's so much publicity around when athletes come out. I think we had the first gay athlete in the NFL draft. People are coming out, that it's easy for students to come out. Well, that is not true. Coming out is a lifelong process, and some students, it's a lot easier than others. And so when somebody is coming out to you, I always say avoid saying, it's going to be okay, look at so-and-so famous actor, because that's not your student's experience. Your student might be living in an unsupportive environment where coming out could mean the loss of parental support, the loss of their community, so really coming out is still, not easy. Homophobia, I think I've said that a couple times, homophobia and transphobia. And this is really a fear, a disgust, a lack of knowledge, just, based on somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity. Homophobia and transphobia sometimes is very obvious. I mean, I'm sure you've heard, like I said before, the words, "that's so gay." Definitely a form of homophobia that we see in the schools. The words faggot are still commonly used. And I would say the biggest form of homophobia that happens in the classrooms with administrations and teachers is not immediately, shutting that kind of anti-gay speech down. So one way that everybody here that can combat homophobia and transphobia is when we hear it, shut it down and talk about why it's not appropriate. So one of the last terms that I'm going to go over is heterosexism, and that's really a value system that being heterosexual or being straight is really the only natural or normal way of walking through the world. Example of heterosexism is all over the place, being able to show affection in public, being able to easily access role models and mentors in the media, not facing rejection from one's family and friends because of sexual orientation and gender identity, and finally benefiting from society's normalcy, really the assumption that heterosexual individuals and relationships are valid, healthy, and really non-deviant. All right, so before I get into some concrete examples on how you can support LGBT students, I'm going to go over a little bit of the data. if you have not heard of them, GLSEN, they're the Gay Lesbian Education Network, and they have done a kind of a climate survey for LGBT students for almost 15 years. And what's been a little scary is that over the 15 years, these statistics haven't really gone down, and they really highlight the experience of a lot of LGBT students in the classroom. And I'm not going to read them all. You can find those on glisten.org. But it's really alarming that 55%, about 55% of students felt unsafe at school by their sexual orientation. So these are our lesbian, gay, bisexual students. And about 37% felt unsafe because of their gender identity and expression. And so these students probably identified as transgender or gender nonconforming. Verbally harassed as well. And that goes really high. Between 55 and 74% of students that are LGBT have experienced verbal harassment. And that's name calling. Those are the phrases that I talked about a little bit earlier. And I think we all know those are still happening in our schools today. Another statistic before I move on is the 51.4% of these students have heard homophobic remarks from their teacher and staff. And these remarks and this statistic has not really gone down over the last 10 years and is probably one of the easiest to change and make an impact on. So the last one of these are heard negative remarks about gender expression. Being transgender, the gender identity different from male and female. The remarks from teachers and staff members can have a huge impact on the student's ability to transition comfortably, safely, and really in a timely manner. All right, I'm going to pull up the Family Acceptance Project. Now this is probably the best research that's out there around why we should support LGBT students, why it's so important for parents, teachers, family, and friends to focus on the student, on where they're at now and not reject them. So you're going to see here that this study it sampled all LGBT individuals. And so what they found was that based on the level of rejection, students were 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide. And so that means that our LGBT students who had support from family, had support from their after-school clubs, from their school, we're going to walk through this life okay and ready to go. But those students who face rejection, their risks went up for suicide, for levels of depression, more likely to use illegal drugs, and more than 3 times likely to be at risk for HIV and sexually transmitted disease. One of the last slides, and this is very important, and we talked about the effects of homophobia and transphobia in school, but these are some other concrete examples of right from the students on what is happening and what is happening when they're not supported in school or when they're not supported in their home. They're 3 times more likely to miss school. So you're seeing a high level of LGBT students dropping out or having to leave a traditional school environment and getting their GED early. You're going to see lower GPA from students that identify as LGBT, that are struggling, that are bullied. And this, of course, the lower GPA will not help with that that higher education option. So our LGBT students that are not having a great experience in school are twice as likely to say that they don't plan on attending college or anything outside of high school. And then again, you're going to see higher levels of depression and lower levels of self-esteem. What are some of the common challenges that our LGBT or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students face? And these are just a broad overview, and I definitely encourage you to read some of the data that I just talked about to get into some of the specifics. But one of the biggest fears that we hear at Jasmine that our students are concerned about is that confidentiality. The concern of being outed. If coming out to a teacher, is the teacher going to tell my parents? If coming out to a counselor, is that counselor, are they allowed to tell my parents? So that fear of being outed it's not going to allow that student to be their full selves. Provider bias, homophobia and transphobia, we all have biases. And it's really up to us to continue to do education and to continue to think about what languages are we using, what terms are we using. A lot of our transgender students face some bias when it comes to pronouns. Oftentimes, they're not referred to as the pronoun that they identify as. They might be referred to as the pronoun that they were assigned at birth. And so some of our students are using gender-neutral pronouns, referring to themselves as they. So language absolutely is a bias that students face. Unaware of their own health risks. The slides that I showed you, before show a high level of, risk of substance use, sexual behavior, the suicide, not really knowing your health risks that need to take care of yourself because you're not hearing about some of these things at home or in the classroom. Past negative experiences, that is huge. You might be watching this as somebody who is a co-sponsor of a Gay Straight Alliance, and you're sitting here thinking, well, that is not me. My classroom is absolutely safe. Well, your classroom might be safe, but if one student has had one negative experience, that's going to impact how they interact with all administration and all teachers. So it's really up to us as advocates, as allies, to continue to make sure students know that we are a safe space, to try to get past their negative experiences. Institutional policies that don't protect them, sexual orientation and gender identity are added to policies across organizations and counties throughout Florida. Volusia County actually has sexual orientation and gender identity in your policy, and so your students all are protected as well as your teachers and staff. Lack of gender-neutral bathrooms. Some students, we talked about gender expression, gender identity. If your gender expression and your gender identity might not line up with your gender assignment at birth, it'd be very difficult to feel safe in the bathroom. So those gender-neutral bathrooms are very important for students to feel safe. And finally, a couple more things: that lack of belonging or that connectedness. It's very isolating not being out. Even though there's images and media, there's LGBT people coming out all the time, it is still very isolating and lonely for that student struggling with their identity. Lack of role models in schools. So if students do not know any other LGBT principals or teachers, then they're missing that in school. They're missing that environment. It's very hard to expect students to feel safe and be out in school if they don't have any out role models. And then finally, kind of like the confidentiality piece, not out to parents or guardians. That's very hard if you're out at school with your peers, but you're not out at home. And so that's another challenge that our students face, is really showing up, who they are all the time. So those are just a few of the challenges. There definitely are many more, and they change just really based on the family support that the students have or they don't have, and they also change, in their environment within their context in school. They might be out to 2 or 3 people, but they might be on a sports team and they might not be out to their team. And so this back and forth is definitely huge. So how do we support our students? Now, I don't have a secret recipe on how to create a safe space or how to support that student coming out, but I do have a few tips. And really the first tip that is absolutely the most important is to listen. Listen and just really give permission for our students to be uncertain about their gender identity, their sexual orientation. Setting the space up for a young person to come out to you as questioning, maybe 2 weeks later for them to be able to come out as lesbian. Maybe at the end of the year, they're talking to you about being queer. Really giving that permission for them to be who they are, no matter where they're at, is really the most important, and not questioning that identity, letting them explore. And then, of course, support that person's understanding that sexual orientation and gender identity are along that spectrum that we talked about a little bit earlier, and that it's okay if they don't know, and it's okay for them just to be who they are. Also helping our young people find positive connections in the LGBT community, whether it's community events, whether it's outside of the school. I know in Jacksonville we have a really great production every year called the Coming Out Monologues, and that is such a family-friendly, healthy way for young students to go and listen to stories and hear people's coming out story that they might not have ever heard before. And so really looking for those resources outside the school. There could be a great documentary coming to town. There could be an LGBT resource center in the area. Making sure to refer the students to resources outside the school will always help. Now, some areas might not have resources, physical resources. There's a huge online community that LGBT students can access that is safe and supportive and really well done, and that's called the Trevor Project. And so students who live in isolated towns or places where they can't go outside of their school to find support, the Trevor Project is a great resource. And then, of course, support the decisions on the students for who to come out to, when they should come out, and what their timeline is. I know it's really scary sitting across from a student who is just coming out to themselves and then is ready to leave your office and tell the entire school and their family, but that's their decision and our decision to support it, just as it's our decision to support them taking their time and you kind of being the only one that might hold that right now. So some other best practices, some questions that we always get besides how can I support students in coming out, are what are gay-straight alliances? So, gay-straight alliances, GSAs as we'll refer to them, they're really a great resource to have in the schools, and they're student-led and teacher and administratively supportive. And I talked about the GLSEN survey, and I said that we hadn't seen much change in atmosphere for LGBT students over the last 10 years. That wasn't entirely true. Where we're seeing the most change in the LGBT student experience is not really in the verbal harassment, and the atmosphere, but it's in the support that they find from teachers and administrators. And so what the survey is finding, that if a school has a gay-straight alliance, they're seeing an improvement in school climate for all students. It's really a statement that biased language, and discrimination is really not accepted, in this school. Gay-straight alliances help students identify supportive teachers, counselors, administrators, and this makes a huge difference to students in the school. I think the magic number is 6, that if students have 6 supportive individuals within their school, that their school experience goes way up, that their feeling of connectedness, that school safety is huge. So I always challenge every organization that I go to really work to identify those 6 people, and you're gonna definitely see a change. The other thing that's great about the gay-straight alliances is, listen, it's bringing communities together. It is providing a great outlet for our heterosexual and straight students to be supportive and to stand up and take leadership roles in creating a safe environment. So a great resource is the GSA network, and that's based out of Oakland, California, and they have from start to finish, how to support students within a gay-straight alliance that I definitely recommend. So a safe space. Safe spaces are very hard to create. We continue to examine how we're creating spaces at Jasmine, and we're an LGBT organization. But really, a safe space is any place where students can feel free to be themselves, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity, that they know they can show up, be who they are, really without judgment or, bullying and harassment. A safe space, they can also go to find resources. They can talk openly to their teachers, their friends about what's going on in their life and what resources that they might need. It's a place where students can feel comfortable, about being gay or being straight or talking about their partner or their boyfriend, just some place where they know, again, they're not going to be judged. And finally, a space where it's okay to talk about LGBT. It's okay to share resources, to talk about movies, that really all LGBT topics and issues are welcome. And then, of course, probably one of the hardest things to create is that respect. A safe space is a place where respect is mandatory. And it's not easy to create. Classrooms are always changing. People in and out of the classrooms are always changing. We have the same problem at Jasmine, is we're always changing. We continually have conversations with our young people that come into Jasmine about how they're showing up in this space and how they can help support other students and people who are different from themselves. Policies. I did mention before that Volusia County has a great policy. It states very clearly that Volusia County does not discriminate based on race, color, national origin, sex, disability, marital status, political beliefs, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, or age in its educational programs, services, or in its hiring practices. This is definitely key in providing a safe space for LGBT students, and it's great that Volusia County has this in place. One of the other resources that you can refer to on best practices when creating an environment for all students is the Human Rights Campaign benchmarks. And so they're benchmarks for cultural competency, and they have about 10 of them, and you're gonna be able to, I'll have that for you guys at the end of this, and you can see where are you at with all these 10 benchmarks. So we have talked about terminology, We've gone over some terms and definitions that I encourage you to Google, look up, find additional resources, because these terms are changing all the time, and it's very important that we use the language our students are using. I've talked a little bit about best practices when supporting young people coming out, when setting up a safe space, when looking at your policies. And now I'm going to go over a few ideas that you as an advocate for LGBT students can be aware of, and use day to day to continue to add to that safe school environment. Definitely one of the first one is, do not assume that everybody you meet is cisgender or heterosexual. Those assumptions, all the time immediately shut down students who might not fit into that role. Continue to challenge what you hear. Continue to not shy away from when you hear negative things about LGBT students. Not shy away from addressing it right then and there. Sometimes people feel a little bit more comfortable waiting until the class is over or waiting until you just get that student alone. But really, trying to send a strong message that anti-LGBT speech and phrases is not going to be accepted in your space. Continuing to educate yourself. This is a great start, and we've gone over some great information, but there's a lot more out there, especially in trying to understand somebody's experience. It's very hard to understand somebody's experience from a PowerPoint or a training. So if you're interested in learning more about what it's like to come out as transgender, or how can I understand my transgender students' journey a little bit, I definitely recommend looking up some autobiographies. Redefining Realness by Janet Mock is amazing, and that really helps people question their concepts of gender, and it really puts a good story and puts a good face on what it might be like for a transgender student. Continue to examine your own biases. We're all biased, and we all are comfortable at different levels with some of the things that I've talked about. You might be listening to this, and you might have, an LGBT, a sister that might be a lesbian, and you've supported her whole life, but you've never really met with or worked with somebody who identifies as transgender, so you're not as confident and comfortable in providing support for transgender students. So continue to examine where you're at, and then definitely continue to try to get to that point where, you are comfortable supporting, all students. Of course, use appropriate language and terminology. I probably have said that over 20 times, and if there's one thing that you can get from this training, is language is so important, and how we talk to students, and how we listen to them, and how we let them self-identify is huge. So language is key. And then one of the last ones on the slide, and this one is sometimes hard to do, but try not to tokenize our LGBT faculty, staff, students. It's very hard for those students to always hold that. If you've got a student who is out, who is proud, they might want to talk, they might want to share their story, but they might not want to. So don't always assume that just because somebody is out, that they can be the example for their entire community, because that is a lot of pressure. And last, there's tons of resources that you can find. Any program or any event or any resource that you can think of has probably been done, and it's very easy to bring into the classroom. Probably one of the most popular and accessible awareness-raising activities is the Day of Silence, and all of these you can Google, and the websites are going to pop up. There's a lot of films out there. The screening of Bullied has been done a lot in classrooms to really help talk about what it's like to be out as a LGBT student. There are LGBT scholarships out there. So if you're supporting an LGBT student that they might not know how they're going to pay for college, there are scholarships out there that they qualify for. So to know about those resources. And then finally, some of the nationally recognized resources that always have great resources are your PFLAGs, your GLSENs, the Human Rights Campaign. I mentioned it before, the Gay Straight Alliance Network. If you're looking to help a student start a Gay Straight Alliance, that's definitely a great place to start, as well as GLSEN. And then finally, I referred to this awesome organization when talking about gender identity and our transgender students, the National Center for Transgender Excellence. They have a whole list of resources on understanding terminology, how to support transgender students, and other different policies that have been implemented, really across the nation. So these are great resources, as well as Jasmine. So even though we are a little bit north of Volusia County. We see students from as south as Miami. We see students from Northeast Georgia. So we're a resource for young people if they can get there, but most importantly, we're a resource for you to call, ask questions, continue this conversation, and we will definitely be happy to support you. Thank you.